Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss any update from Rouse IAS Study Circle. Join the only official Telegram channel of Rouse IAS Study Circle to get the relevant materials and important updates.
Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of the newspaper analysis from the Civil Service Examinations perspective. So today we are going to discuss the Hindu Delhi edition dated 13th May 2022. The topics to be discussed have been displayed on your screen and a timestamping of the same has been provided in the description box below. Now let us start with our first topic. On page number 14, the news has appeared which reads GDP growth to be almost 8% this fiscal year. This topic has come in the context that recently the Finance Ministry has said that despite the inflationary headwinds, because of certain important steps, especially the capex driven fiscal path which was laid down in our budget, our economy will recover at almost 8% of the real growth. In this regard, in today's session, we are going to discuss the basic concepts of the GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product. In this session, we will discuss about the definition of the GDP, what exactly do we mean by economic territory, and the related aspects, for example, gross national product, nominal GDP, real GDP, as well as the recent trends. So now let us begin our discussion. First of all, we should know that what exactly do we mean by gross domestic product. For this to understand, let us first imagine the life cycle of some product. Let us take an example of sugar, which is the end product. Now what happens is that the sugar cane is obtained. This sugar cane is transported to factories or mills whereby it is processed, and here it is being converted into sugar. Then this is distributed to the retail markets. Then it comes to our consumers. Now there are also wholesalers. I have taken this example just to explain certain things, right? So let us assume that the sugar cane was produced at a rupees of 10. Then it was being transported to factories, and let us assume that rupees 5 was spent to transport this amount of sugarcane to the factories. When it reaches the factories, it becomes rupees 15. Now there is a processing cost which converts this sugarcane into sugar. Let us assume again this processing cost is rupees 5, and then the sugar is made rupees 20. Now again the distribution cost, let us assume again 5. So to the retailer it reaches at 25. Then again the distribution cost to the consumer, let's say again 5, it reaches 25. Now there are certain taxes also, then there are certain profit margins also which will be added to this, and let us assume that we get it at rupees 35. So here, this is the final market value of the sugar from the consumer's perspective. This is the final value of the sugar cane from the factory's perspective. And all these things are the intermediary cost which are added to the final cost. Correct? So now let us see the definition of GDP. The GDP is the market value of all the final goods and services, that is this one, which are produced within the economic territory of India, if we are talking about India, right? So that is why every country has its own GDP. Every country has its own gross domestic product. But the GDP of that particular country will be the final value, no intermediary values, the final value of the goods and services which are produced within the economic territory, which is also sometimes known as domestic territory. Now, what is domestic territory? Which are those areas which are included in the domestic territory? Now, this domestic territory is different from the political territory. For example, the political territory of India is the complete map of India which we know, correct? From Jammu and Kashmir to the Kanyakumari, from Gujarat to Arunachal Pradesh, all this area is the political territory of country. But now there are certain areas, for example, special economic zones. For example, in Mumbai port, there is a special economic zone. Now this SEZ will not be included in India's territory when we have to calculate the GDP, right? Because from the economic, that is why the term written here is the economic territory. From the economy perspective, this SEZ is a foreign territory, and that is why suppose the good has to be transported from a SEZ in Mumbai to a district in UP, then it will be considered as import. This means that there is a considerable difference between the political territory as well as the economic territory. Now, what all constitutes the economic territory? It has a list. First is the political frontiers, which also includes the territorial waters as well as the airspace. That means if this is the coast of India and up to 12 nautical miles in the sea, we have territorial waters. So, whatever final goods and services is produced in this ocean area also up to the territorial waters will be considered the part of India's GDP. Second, all the embassies, consulates, military bases, etc. of India located abroad. For example, Indian embassy located in USA will be considered as the economic territory of India despite it is in the political boundaries of USA. And on the same logic, the embassy of USA, which is located in India, will be the part of USA's GDP and not the Indian GDP. Correct? Next is the ships, aircrafts, etc., which are operated by Indian residents between two or more countries. For example, Air India services between different countries will also be part of India's GDP. Similarly, the fishing vessels, oil and natural gas rigs, floating platforms operated by Indian residents in the international waters or engaged in the extraction in the areas where the country has exclusive rights of operation. So, all these areas are considered as economic territory of India. Correct? So this is the basic concept of GDP. Now GDP further is of two types, that is the nominal GDP as well as the real GDP. Now you must have heard that our GDP has increased by 10% or 8%. So 10% or 8% for these values to come, there should be a certain base value, right? If I am saying that it has risen 10%, so the natural question is that on what base value? Since when it is risen 10%, correct? So that is why there is a base year to measure a GDP. For example, in 2012, the GDP was, let's say, rupees 100, and in 2020 the GDP is rupees 150. So we will say that there is an increase of 50%, right? Similarly, GDP in 2022 might be rupees 250, correct? Now, if the GDP is being measured at the base year, it will be termed as real GDP because it is the past. If the GDP is measured today, that is the current year, it will be known as the current GDP. Now, what has changed since 2012 to 2022? Inflation. Because let's say the price of biscuit in 2012 was rupees 10, and now because of inflation in 2022 the price has increased to rupees 20. So we will say that there is an inflation of rupees 10, that is the general rise in the price levels of the product. Clear? Now let us look at the definitions. The nominal GDP refers to the GDP at the current market price. That is, GDP is calculated as per the market price for the year for which the GDP is calculated. And real GDP refers to the GDP at the base year price. It is calculated as per the market price in the base year. The real GDP negates the inflation in goods and services. That means the real GDP, if the price of the biscuit in 2012 was to be considered, you will minus the inflation of 10. That is, presently it is 20 rupees minus inflation, that is 10. This one you get the value of rupees 10. I hope this is very clear. In case of high rate of inflation, the nominal GDP would be higher than the real GDP,
Correct? In this very example, because we have a positive inflation of 10 rupees, it is added to this 10 and we get today 20. However, in the case of deflation, that is the fall in the prices of product. Now in 2012, we had 10 rupees biscuit, but now because of the deflation in 2022, we have rupees 8 biscuit. So that means the prices have fallen by rupees 2. In this very sense, the real GDP, that is this 2012, would be higher than the nominal GDP. So it is not true that nominal GDP will always be higher than real GDP. Reason being, the inflation, if it is positive, it will be higher, and if it is negative, that is deflation, it will be lower. Correct? Now we'll move towards our next concept, that is gross domestic product versus gross national product, that is the GNP. Now there is a significant difference between GDP and GNP. In GDP, we learned that all final goods and services which is produced within the domestic territory, that is within the economic territory of India, will be the GDP of India. So that means that GDP takes into account the contribution of all the residents, whether he or she is a citizen of India or not. The point is that if he or she is living in India and producing some goods and services within India, it will be the part of GDP. And hence it excludes the Indian citizens outside India. If any Indian citizen is producing some good in, let's say, USA, it will not be the part of GDP. We have learned that. But while calculating gross national product, we take into account the contribution of all the citizens. That means the citizens who are within India and the citizens who are outside India. And therefore, we say that gross national product is the GDP plus the income earned by the Indians outside India minus the incomes earned by foreigners within India. And this is known as the factor income from abroad. Hence, GNP, that is gross national product, is the GDP plus net factor income from abroad. Now, this net factor income from abroad can also be positive, can also be negative. That is why GNP can also be higher or lower than the GDP, depending upon we have positive value of net factor income or the negative value of net factor income. So now let us revise this topic in brief once again. First, we understood the basic concept of the GDP that refers to the value of all the final goods and services which are produced within the economic territory of India. And here we learned that there is a difference between economic territory as well as political territory. For example, the SEZ is within the political boundaries of India. Still, it is not within the economic territory. And there are certain key areas which are to be remembered. For example, the embassies, military bases of India located abroad, the ships or aircrafts operated by residents in the high seas, fishing vessels, oil and natural gas rigs which are being operated in international waters, or the areas where India has exclusive rights, all these will be considered within the economic territory of India. Then we learned about the difference between nominal and real GDP. The real GDP is calculated as the base year and the nominal GDP is calculated at the current year. That means it takes into account the inflation. Then we learnt about the difference between the GDP and GNP. GNP refers to the GDP plus net factor income from abroad. Now in this continuation, I also want to discuss with you people the trends of GDP in recent years because there are several questions which are also being asked related to the trends. Now here we have two graphs shown in front of you. The first graph compares the absolute values of the GDP, that is in lakhs crore, and the second graph shows the GDP growth rates, that is the real as well as nominal. So the rates, that is why, are expressed in percentage and absolute values are expressed in the numerical numbers. Now this graph shows that both the real GDP as well as the nominal GDP. Now this color reflects you the real GDP and this is the nominal GDP. And as you can see that real as well as nominal GDP had registered consistent increase in terms of absolute value before 2020 to 21. Both real GDP and nominal GDP contracted in 2020 to 21. This shows the contraction. However, both the real GDP as well as nominal GDP have now come back to the pre-COVID levels. Here you can see that in 2019 to 20 financial year we had this figure as 144, but the corresponding figure in this year is 133. This shows the contraction. Similarly, 201 has reduced to 195. But again, in this particular year, from 133 we have increased to 146, and 195 we have increased to 230. So there is a bit contraction because of the COVID-induced slowdown in 2020 to 21 financial year. Now we will come to the growth rates of real and nominal GDP. This graph shows that the growth rates have registered consistent decline before 2020 to 21. For example, in 2016 to 17 we have the figure 8.3%, then 6.9%, then 6.6%, and then 4.2%. Now this is very important. Be very clear that whether the question is asking about the absolute GDP or it is asking about the growth rates of GDP. Then because of the COVID-19, the real as well as nominal GDP growth rates contracted in 2020 to 21 financial year. However, after that, now they have registered a positive growth rate in 21 to 22. I hope this is very clear to you. Now comes the topic on page number 7. This topic reads, did the RBI wait too long to raise the interest rates? Now, as we all know, that RBI is tasked with controlling the inflation in our country. And this topic is very important from the economy's perspective. And in this very sense, in today's session, we will learn the types of inflation which is being measured in India. So primarily in India, the inflation is measured from two indices, that is WPI, that is the wholesale price index, and the CPI, that is consumers price index. So in today's session, we will learn the basic difference between these two indices with regard to the inflation measurement in India. So these are the factual details which must be remembered by you people in order to solve the questions, especially in prelims examination. So the first column represents the wholesale price index, that is WPI, and the second column represents consumer price index. And as the name is suggesting, the WPI measures the inflation at the wholesale level and CPI measures the inflation at the retail level, that is from the consumer's perspective. And now because we are the end consumers, so that is why the inflation which is most relevant in our scenario is the CPI. And in this sense, the inflation which RBI takes into account is also the CPI part. The WPI is calculated by Office of Economic Advisor, which falls under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. On the other hand, CPI is measured by National Statistical Office, which is under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Very important difference. Base year for WPI is 2011 to 12 and base year for CPI is 2012. Now as far as the categories are concerned, WPI has three categories. First is the primary articles, second is the manufactured products, and third is the fuel and power. And out of these three categories, the manufactured products have been given the highest weightage. In CPI, we have these categories: foods and beverages, pan, tobacco and intoxicants, clothing and footwear, housing, fuel and light, miscellaneous categories, that is education, healthcare and transportation, etc. And out of these categories, foods and beverages have the maximum weightage. Now we should understand that what is the impact of the increase in prices of the food items on WPI and CPI. Now this is very simple. In WPI, because the manufactured products have the highest weightage, so that is why the increase in the prices of the food items will be lesser in WPI compared to CPI. In CPI, the maximum weightage has been given to foods and beverages. So obviously when the prices of food items will increase, this will also increase, and hence the CPI will have a larger impact. In WPI, services are not included. In CPI, they are included. In WPI, indirect taxes are not included because these are at the wholesale level, but the indirect taxes are levied at the consumer level. So in CPI, the indirect taxes are included. And as we have discussed initially, the RBI targets the CPI level, not the WPI. And what we know that the targeting range of the RBI is to keep the inflation within the limits of 4 plus minus 2%, that is the range of 2% to 6%. Now, in continuation with this, you should also know the difference between the headline and the core inflation. Now, headline is the overall inflation which includes everything. It refers to the inflation in the CPI or the WPI, covering all the categories of goods and services. But if we take core inflation into account, we have to exclude the volatile categories. For example, the food and fuel. That is, you minus the food and fuel from the headline inflation, you get the core inflation. Presently, the RBI targets CPI headline rate of inflation and not the core inflation. Again, this fact is also very relevant. Now comes this topic. This topic has appeared on page number 11 in today's newspaper, and the topic reads Prime Minister calls for the WHO reform. And this is the very context of this particular topic. Now, this topic is very important as far as the UPSC's exam is concerned in prelims as well as mains examination. And in this very regard, we will discuss the various issues as well as suggestions which are related to the WHO governance. In the backdrop of the COVID aftermath, we all witness the role played by World Health Organization in dealing with this global pandemic. And in this very regard, it came to the light of the common masses the issues which WHO was facing. In this very regard, we should understand the issues involved. So here in front of you lies the issues and suggestions in the tabular format, which will make it easy for you to understand and memorize these things. First is the public health emergency of international concern process. Now, in the COVID time, we witnessed that just in declaring the public health emergency, WHO took a lot of time. So that is why the issues of delay and confusion came to forefront. In this very regard, it is suggested that objective criteria must be designed in order to declare that when is the situation of the public health emergency. Now, presently, the decision is consensus based, which means until and unless all the members do not agree that this is the situation of public health emergency, WHO cannot declare it as to be such. So that is why it is suggested that Director General of the WHO must be given power to declare the PHEIC, and the organization must not wait for a consensus to emerge. We can go by the majority rule. That is, if the majority members agree to the situation, then it can be declared. Now, the second issue is related to the funding. Now, the funding of the WHO is such that most of the funds are met through the extra budgetary contributions. The WHO has a very little flexibility in utilizing those funds, and even the health emergency programs is not fully funded from the regular budget of the WHO. Now, because most of the funds are extra budgetary, it means that WHO as an organization is not very much financially independent. It has to depend on extra budgetary sources. That is why it is recommended that the regular budget of the WHO must be increased so that most of the core activities of the WHO are financed through it. The third issue is related to the transparency and accountability. There is no regular and institutional mechanism to discuss the selection of activities, expenditure, and monitoring. Further, there is no review with respect to the value for the money which is spent on such activities. That is why it is suggested to have a robust financial accountability frameworks as well as continuous and regular data reporting.
Next comes the response capacities. Now, WHO as a health institution can only respond in an efficient manner if it has a significant infrastructure capabilities. But during the COVID times, we witnessed that there lie critical gaps in the basic health infrastructure, especially in the developing countries. That is why it is advised and suggested to create international health regulation technical and core competencies in each country so as to have a uniform response mechanisms even in developing and least developing economies. Next issue comes of the governance structure. Now, presently there are two policy making organs of the WHO. The first is the World Health Assembly, that is WHA, and second is the Executive Board, that is EB. Now, they are currently playing a peripheral role because WHO is a technical organization dealing with a highly specialized subject, that is health. And because of this, and that is why most of the work which is there in WHO is done by the technical committee composed of independent experts. So there are a lot of suggestions in this very regard. First, the say of the member states, that is countries, must be increased. Second, standing committee of the executive board must be designed to ensure effective supervision by member states. Third, the technical committees must be composed in such a manner to make them more effective and responsive. Fourth, independent oversight and advisory committee must be strengthened. And last, experts, academicians, policymakers, especially from the high disease burden nations, must be integrated in the governance structure in order to make decisions and policies in a better manner. Next issue is related to the health regulation implementations. Now, member states have self-reporting obligations, which means that they are not pressurized by some external agency and there is no compulsion. However, issue is not of the compulsion because there are several developing and least developing countries which do not have adequate resources to implement all the regulations of the WHO. So that is why the self-reporting should be encouraged, but the developed countries must provide assistance to the developing economies in order to implement the international health regulations. And the last issue is related to the accessibility of the vaccines as well as other medicines. During COVID times, we also witnessed a phenomenon of vaccine nationalism. There were several developed countries which were engaging in the bilateral agreements because of which the developing countries, especially of the Africa, were not getting adequate medicines. In this regard, the TRIPS waiver as proposed by the India and South Africa can go a long way to solve this particular issue. So in today's session, we have discussed the issues and suggestions in the context of WHO in terms of PHEIC process, funding, transparency and accountability, response capacities, governance structure, IHR implementation, and vaccine access. Now this will help you to write a very good mains answer if it comes in this very context. Now this topic has appeared in text and the context page in today's The Hindu Delhi edition. This topic is in relation to the India's hypertension control initiative. Now as we all know that hypertension is related to the blood pressure, and in recent times it has been witnessed that in India non-communicable diseases which are mostly associated with the lifestyle changes are rising. Few years back there was also a report by WHO focusing towards India facing double burden of disease. This double burden of disease was related to that on one hand the communicable diseases are not reducing in India, but on the other hand the non-communicable diseases are rising. So in this very sense, the hypertension control initiatives gain significance. As far as the latest context of this particular news article is concerned, that recently India's hypertension control initiative has came up with certain important findings,
which says that around quarter of the 2.1 million Indians have uncontrolled blood pressure levels. Now, going by the UPSC syllabus, this initiative is particularly relevant from the prelims examinations perspective because it mentions a section of economic and social development, sustainable development, poverty, inclusion, demographics, and social sector initiatives. So, that is why the hypertension control initiatives will form the part of this particular subheading. Now, before coming to this particular initiative, let us first understand the background of hypertension. Now, hypertension is related to the blood pressure levels. Now, this blood pressure level is obviously, as by the common understanding we know, is related to the heart pumping. Now, there are two types of blood pressures. One is the systolic pressure, other is the diastolic pressure. From the common understanding, we know that the normal blood pressure is 120 by 80. So this 120 pressure is of the systole and 80 is of the diastole. Now what exactly is the systolic and diastolic blood pressure? Now the primary function of the heart is to pump the blood in the body. Now let us assume that this is our heart. Now this diagram is not from the biology perspective. Just to understand, I have drawn here a rough diagram. So now we'll see that how the heart functions. There are two primary functions. First is that when the heart will squeeze in, that is the heart will compress, it will push the blood from the heart to our body. Correct? On the other hand, when the heart will relax, that is, it will expand, then the blood will come into the heart. So this contraction position is known as systole and the relaxed position is known as diastole. Now from the very basic common logic we know that when something will squeeze in, that is, it is being contracted, the pressure in it will rise. That is why the systolic pressure is on the higher side and the diastolic pressure is on the lower side. So this is the normal blood pressure levels. But when the systolic pressure exceeds 140 and the diastolic pressure exceeds 90, this situation is known as the situation of hypertension, that is the high blood pressure levels. Clear? Now, hypertension is a non-communicable disease and it is mainly associated with the lifestyle changes. For example, nowadays we are having the diets which are very high in trans fats or cholesterol levels. Now, this particular dietary habit leads to higher chances of hypertension in human body. And as far as the Indian context is concerned, it is found from the findings of National Family Health Survey, which has recently released its data. It has said that the hypertension levels in the southern states are far greater than the national average. And if we compare the men and women above the age of 15 years, 21% of the women face hypertension and 24% of the men face hypertension. In this backdrop, it is very important that we know that what exactly is the India's hypertension initiative. Now this initiative was launched in 2017 as a 5-year initiative and it was launched by Health Ministry along with the state governments, along with Indian Council of Medical Research and important WHO India. Now recently, as we have discussed in the context, this initiative has given us certain findings. It has said that out of the total patients which came under this initiative, around quarter of those patients have uncontrolled blood pressure levels. Out of the total patients, around 27 patients were such who came in the first cycle but they didn't return for the follow-up. Now, this is one of the biggest issues in the social sector initiatives which are mainly related with the health. For example, this similar issue is also in the drug control problem. The rehabilitation centers are built by the government and there the people, drug addicts, come for the first time, but there is a very high dropout rate in the follow-ups.
Coming back to this particular initiative, around 20 crore adults in India are facing the challenge of hypertension. Now, in this very regard, one more important fact is the 25 by 25 goal. Because the question can also be asked directly in the prelim examination regarding this particular goal. So, what is 25 by 25 goal? Now, this goal aims to reduce the premature mortality due to non communicable diseases by 25% by 2025, and India has committed to this particular goal. In this very regard, as we have discussed, that hypertension is also one of the non communicable diseases. That is why this initiative also fulfills the India's international targets. Now, this topic has appeared at page number 12, and the topic reads Hunger Risks from Climate Threat. Now, as we all know that climate change is a reality in today's time and it is impacting each and every sphere of human life. And one of the major impacts of climate change is on the food systems. It is directly impacting the food availability, agriculture, crops, food distribution, as well as food management. In this very regard, the latest context of this article is that recently there was a report by the International Food Policy Research Institute, also known as IFPRI, on climate change and food systems. In the particular context of India, it has said that India's food production could drop 16% and the number of those at risk for hunger could increase 23% by 2030 due to climate change. Now, hunger and poverty are one of the biggest issues which India faces. It is estimated that around 25% of the global hunger burden is shared by India alone. In this very regard, this report gains very significance. Plus, we also know that in UPSC Prelims examination, the report-based questions are very common. In this very regard, in today's session, we will discuss about the one important model of IFPRI, that is the impact model. Now, what exactly is the impact model? It stands for the International Model for Policy Analysis of Agricultural Commodities and Trade. So, first important thing is that impact model of IFPRI is related to agricultural commodities and trade. It was developed in early 1990s to explore the long-term challenges facing policymakers in reducing the hunger and poverty in a sustainable fashion. Currently, the impact is a network of several models, which in itself includes economic models, water models, as well as crop models. Now, this is because economy, water, crops all are important components of a food system. The core of the impact model is built on the equilibrium multi-market economic model, which simulates the national and international agricultural markets. And this makes the impact model to support the integrated analysis of changing environmental, biophysical, and socio-economic trends, which further allows for the in-depth analysis on variety of critical issues of interest to policymakers at several levels, including national, international, as well as regional levels. So, in UPSC prelims, a direct question on impact model can also be asked. As far as this news article is concerned, there are important findings of this impact model which has appeared in today's The Hindu paper. It says that the number of Indians at risk from hunger in 2030 is expected to be around 74 million. And if the factor of climate change is also taken, it would increase to around 90 million. Further, in a region-wise comparison, it says that developing countries will face more increase in the production as well as demand because of the rise in population and income levels. And the third interesting finding of this very model is that in recent time, the dietary patterns are shifting. They are shifting towards higher value foods, including fruits, vegetables, processed foods, animal source foods, etc. And this change in the dietary pattern is more observed in the countries which are outside the high income countries, that is, the developing countries, especially.
So this was a very brief topic. In this topic, we learned about the impact model. So now is the time for the reference article of the day. This topic has appeared on page number 6 in the editorial section. The topic reads Importance of Consent. Now the consent mentioned over here is in relation to the marital rape. And the article has come in the recent context regarding the split verdict in the Delhi High Court on the question of criminalizing the marital rape. Now, this particular topic has already been covered in the DNS dated 4th February 2022, whereby in detail the reasons, arguments in favor, and arguments in against criminalizing the marital rape were discussed. So I request you to go back to the DNS dated 4th February 2022 in order to holistically understand this particular topic. Now is the time for the question of the day. The question asked in yesterday's DNS was in relation to the rupee depreciation. The question asked which among the following steps are likely to be taken to counter the rupee depreciation. First was encourage more FDI. Second, curbing the import of non-essential items. Third, discouraging FPI outflows. So all the three steps are likely to be taken to counter the rupee depreciation. That is why option D, that is 1, 2 and 3 is the correct answer. The question from today's DNS is in relation to the concept of national income. The question says, which among the following constitute economic territory of a country X for the calculation of national income? There are 4 items given. First, political frontiers of country X. Second, territorial waters and airspace of country X. Third, consulates and military bases of country X located abroad. And fourth, consulates and military bases of other countries located in country X. The options given are as follow. A, 1 only. B, 1 and 2 only. C, 1, 2 and 3 only. Or D, 1, 2, 3 and 4. So that's all for today. All the very best. Study hard.